The wind screamed against the reinforced glass. Beyond the heavy timber frames of the isolation ward, the Cascade Mountains were drowning in a blinding whiteout. Inside, the silence was heavier than the snow. Clara pressed her hand against the swollen curve of her stomach. A dull, heavy ache radiated through her lower back, a phantom weight pulling her toward the polished hardwood floor. She ignored it. She was 7 months pregnant, working the graveyard shift at a facility that did not officially exist on any public map. This was the Sanctuary. It was an elite, highly classified psychiatric and physical rehabilitation lodge built exclusively for Tier 1 military operatives. Hidden deep within the alpine wilderness, it was a place where broken ghosts came to put their pieces back together. Clara leaned against the nurse's station, letting out a long, slow breath. The air in the lodge always smelled of crushed pine needles, wood smoke, and medical-grade antiseptic. It was a strange, comforting contradiction. She rubbed her lower back again, wincing as a sharp twinge echoed down her spine. She told herself it was just the fatigue. She had been on her feet for 9 hours. The baby was growing heavy, pressing against her spine, demanding space she barely had left to give. She whispered a quiet reassurance to her unborn son, a soft promise that she would sit down soon, but she knew she would not. Sitting down meant stopping. Stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering the twisted metal of a rescue helicopter scattered across a different mountain range exactly 1 year ago. Her husband had been a pilot. He had spent his life pulling stranded climbers off jagged peaks. He had died doing exactly that. Now, Clara worked the night shift because the profound, isolated quiet of the sanctuary was the only thing that kept her away from the suffocating emptiness of her own home. Here, surrounded by heavily secured doors and the sleeping forms of men who had seen the worst of the world, she felt a strange kinship. They were all surviving something. The heavy steel doors of the primary intake bay groaned open, shattering the midnight quiet. A rush of freezing air swept down the main corridor, carrying the bitter scent of ozone and ice. Clara stood up straight, smoothing her scrubs over her stomach, pushing the pain aside. A secure transport had arrived. The storm had delayed them by 6 hours, but the military did not care about the weather. Through the frosted glass of the intake vestibule, Clara watched the new arrival step out of the armored vehicle. His name was Elias Thorne. He was a former Navy SEAL sniper, newly admitted, and according to his heavily redacted file, highly combative. He moved with a stiff, guarded aggression, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Even through the heavy layers of his winter coat, Clara could see the rigid tension in his frame. He was a man locked in a state of permanent war. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress, carrying scars that were both visible and buried deep within his mind. But Elias was not alone. Walking perfectly in step with his left leg was a massive Belgian Malinois. The dog wore a worn, faded tactical harness, the heavy nylon frayed at the edges from years of brutal deployments. This was Kodiak. He was a former combat tracking and improvised explosive device detection dog. He had been cross-trained to find bleeding survivors buried under earthquake rubble. Now, he served as the psychiatric service dog for a man who trusted absolutely no one else on Earth. Clara watched as the intake staff tried to guide Elias through the metal detectors. Elias refused to speak. He simply stared through the orderlies, his eyes flat and dead, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his beard. Kodiak sat instantly at his side, his dark eyes tracking every single movement in the room. The dog was hyper-vigilant. He did not sniff the floor or wag his tail. He scanned the environment with the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned soldier. He was looking for threats. Dr. Eris Vance, the medical director of the facility, stepped out of his office. He was a calm, analytical man, highly experienced in combat trauma. He took one look at the escalating tension in the intake bay and caught Clara's eye. He gave her a subtle nod. Clara understood. The orderlies were making Elias feel cornered. Clara was the only one who could defuse this. She walked slowly toward the vestibule, keeping her hands visible, her posture relaxed. She did not look at Elias with pity, nor did she look at him with fear. She approached him with the quiet, unshakable empathy of a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to have your world torn apart. She introduced herself softly. She did not ask him how he was feeling. She simply told him that his private cabin was warm, that the storm was locked outside, and that she needed to do a brief medical intake before he could sleep. Elias looked at her. His eyes dropped briefly to her pregnant stomach, then back to her face. He gave a single, curt nod. He did not say a word. He turned and followed her down the long, dimly lit breezeway that connected the main medical wing to the isolated residential cabins. Kodiak followed, his heavy paws completely silent on the rubberized floor. The wind howled violently as they walked, rattling the thick glass panes of the corridor. Clara felt another deep, pulling ache in her abdomen. It was stronger this time, a heavy, dragging sensation that made her breath catch in her throat. She gripped the handrail for a fraction of a second, forcing herself to keep walking. She told herself it was just Braxton Hicks contractions. It was normal. She was tired. She just needed to finish this intake, get back to the nurse's station, and drink some water. They reached cabin 4. It was a small, heavily timbered room with a roaring fireplace and reinforced windows looking out into the black, swirling blizzard. Elias walked in and immediately went to the furthest corner of the room. He sat on the edge of the heavy wooden bed, his back against the wall, giving himself a clear view of the door. It was a classic tactical positioning. He was securing his perimeter. Kodiak immediately began a sweeping patrol of the room, sniffing the vents, the corners, and the space under the bed. Once he was satisfied the room was clear, he returned to Elias and sat heavily at his feet. Clara stepped into the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The dim, warm light of the fireplace cast long shadows across the floor. She pulled a rolling stool over to the bed and sat down, giving Elias plenty of space. She unclipped her medical tablet and her blood pressure cuff. She spoke to him in a low, steady voice, explaining every movement before she made it. She asked for his arm. Elias hesitated, his eyes darting to the door, then back to her. Slowly, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a landscape of jagged, silver scars. Clara wrapped the cuff around his bicep. As the machine hummed and inflated, she checked the bandages on his opposite shoulder. He had recently undergone surgery for a shrapnel wound that had never properly healed. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. Clara felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her. The edges of her vision blurred. A sharp, breathless cramp ripped through her lower stomach, entirely different from the dull ache she had been feeling all night. This was a cold, piercing agony. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. She forced herself to breathe through her nose, hiding her wince behind the glow of the medical tablet. She could not show weakness here. Elias was already on a razor's edge. If she collapsed, if she panicked, it could trigger a severe trauma response in him. She powered through the pain, logging his blood pressure, which was elevated but expected. She checked his temperature. She noted the condition of his bandages. Every second felt like an hour. The pain in her abdomen was not fading. It was spreading, a slow, heavy warmth pooling deep inside her. She unstrapped the blood pressure cuff and stood up. Her legs felt like lead. The room tilted slightly, and she had to lock her knees to keep from swaying. She smiled softly at Elias, telling him that the intake was complete and that she would leave him to rest. She turned toward the door, desperate to get out into the hallway, desperate to reach the emergency phone on the wall. Before she could take a single step, a blur of dark fur and muscle shot across the room. Kodiak moved with lightning speed. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply launched himself across the floor and slammed his massive body horizontally across the closed door. He stood broadside, completely blocking her exit. Clara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked down at the massive dog. Kodiak was staring directly at her, his amber eyes wide and unblinking. His ears were pinned flat against his skull. The muscles in his shoulders were coiled tight, trembling with an intense, suppressed energy. Clara took a slow, deep breath, trying to keep her voice perfectly calm. She looked over her shoulder at Elias, who was still sitting on the edge of the bed. She politely asked him to call his dog. She kept her tone light, acting as if this was just a simple misunderstanding. Elias frowned. He leaned forward, his voice a harsh, gravelly rasp. It was the first time he had spoken since he arrived. He gave a sharp, guttural command in Dutch. It was the absolute recall command. It meant drop everything and return to the handler immediately. Kodiak did not move. Elias stood up, his eyes narrowing in confusion. He repeated the command, louder this time, his voice cracking like a whip in the quiet room. Kodiak ignored him. It was a first. In all their years of combat, in all the chaos of firefights and explosions, the dog had never once disobeyed a direct order, but right now the dog was entirely focused on Clara. Slowly, deliberately, Kodiak stepped away from the door. He did not break eye contact with Clara. He took one step forward, then another. He moved with a strange, stiff-legged gait, his head lowered, his nose twitching frantically as he pulled the scent from the air. Clara felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She did not know what the dog was doing. She did not know if he was going to attack. Kodiak stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her. He lowered his massive head, his nose hovering just inches from her swollen stomach. And then, he dropped into a rigid, trembling stance. His front left paw hovered in the air. His tail went dead straight, his entire body locked up like a statue, vibrating with intense focus. His nose was pointed directly, unmistakably, at Clara's abdomen. It was the point stance. It was the exact, highly trained posture used by military working dogs to signal the presence of a live, active, explosive device. Elias stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained from his face. He stared at his dog, his mind racing, trying to process what he was seeing. He knew that stance better than he knew his own reflection. He had seen Kodiak strike that exact pose 100 times in the dusty streets of foreign cities, saving his life by inches. But there were no bombs here. They were in a secure medical facility in the mountains. Then, a horrifying realization washed over Elias. Kodiak was not just an explosive detection dog. He was cross-trained for search and rescue. He was trained to find survivors buried deep under the rubble of collapsed buildings. He was trained to smell subsurface trauma. He was trained to smell hidden, pooling blood. Elias looked from the dog to Clara. He saw the pale, ashen color of her skin. He saw the fine sheen of sweat on her forehead. He saw the way she was swaying, ever so slightly, on her feet. Clara tried to step around the dog. She felt suddenly, overwhelmingly dizzy. The edges of the room began to darken, closing in like a tunnel. She reached out, trying to grab the edge of the wooden dresser to steady herself. She whispered that she just needed to get to the hallway. Kodiak did not let her move. He stepped forward, closing the distance instantly. He did not bite her. He did not jump on her. Instead, he forcefully thrust his heavy, scarred snout directly into her right hip. He hit her with the precision of a guided missile, striking the exact center of the red medical panic button clipped to her heavy utility belt. The button clicked hard. Instantly, the quiet of the lodge was shattered. High-pitched, strobing alarms blared through the corridors. Red emergency lights began flashing above the cabin door, painting the room in harsh, rhythmic pulses of crimson. The sudden noise was deafening. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her stomach. The pain that had been building inside her suddenly ruptured, tearing through her core with an agony so absolute it stole the breath from her lungs. Her vision went completely black. Her knees buckled. The floor rushed up to meet her. She never hit the ground. Elias crossed the room in a fraction of a second. The combative, isolated soldier vanished, replaced instantly by the highly trained operator. He caught Clara under the arms, taking her full weight before she could strike the hardwood floor. He lowered her gently to the rug, shouting her name, trying to keep her conscious. Kodiak was pacing frantically around them, whining high in his throat, his nose constantly nudging Clara's shoulder. The cabin door burst open. Dr. Vance and the rapid response medical team flooded into the room, pushing a heavy crash cart over the threshold. The alarms were still screaming. Dr. Vance dropped to his knees beside Clara, his eyes scanning her pale face, checking her pulse. He looked at Elias, demanding to know what happened. Elias did not hesitate. He pointed at Kodiak, who was still whining, staring at Clara's stomach. Elias shouted over the alarms, his voice thick with panic, telling the doctor that the dog alerted on her. He told him the dog smelled blood, hidden blood. Dr. Vance did not question the soldier. He did not question the dog. He knew the history of these animals. He immediately ordered the nurses to cut away Clara's scrub top. He grabbed the portable ultrasound wand from the crash cart, smearing a thick layer of cold gel across Clara's swollen abdomen. He stared at the small digital monitor, his jaw tightening as the grainy black and white image flickered into view. The room fell into a terrifying, suspended silence beneath the blaring alarms. Dr. Vance's face went completely rigid. He looked up at the trauma nurses, his voice deadly serious. He announced a severe, silent placental abruption. The placenta had completely detached from the uterine wall. There was no external warning. There was no visible sign. Clara was hemorrhaging massively, bleeding to death internally, drowning her unborn child in the process. Chaos erupted. The medical team moved with frantic, coordinated precision. They slammed intravenous lines into Clara's arms, pushing fluids and synthetic blood expanders into her collapsing veins. Dr. Vance grabbed his radio, switching to the emergency aviation channel. He shouted into the microphone, demanding an immediate Priority 1 helicopter medical evacuation. The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the static, barely audible over the howling wind outside. The dispatcher refused. The storm was too severe. The crosswinds over the mountain pass were exceeding 60 miles per hour. Visibility was zero. It was a suicide mission for any pilot to fly into the Cascades tonight. Dr. Vance slammed his fist against the floor. He screamed into the radio, his calm demeanor entirely shattered. He told the dispatcher that he had a mother and a child bleeding to death on his floor, and they had less than 20 minutes before they both flatlined. He demanded they find a pilot crazy enough to fly, or he would carry her down the mountain himself. There was a long, agonizing pause on the radio. Then, a different voice cut through the static. It was a pilot from the Regional Search and Rescue Squadron. He had heard the call. He knew the coordinates of the sanctuary. He said he was spinning up his rotors. He gave them an estimated time of arrival of 12 minutes. Dr. Vance threw the radio aside. He looked at the team. They could not wait for the chopper to land. They had to be on the helipad, ready to load her the second the skids touched the tarmac. They rolled a collapsible tactical stretcher into the room. They lifted Clara's limp, unconscious body onto the canvas, strapping her down tight, but the stretcher was too wide to navigate the tight corners of the cabin hallway on its wheels. They had to carry her. Dr. Vance grabbed the front handles. He looked back at his nurses, realizing they did not have the physical strength to carry her through the heavy snowdrifts outside. Elias stepped forward. He pushed the nurses aside. He grabbed the rear handles of the stretcher, his massive scarred hands locking onto the metal poles. He looked at Dr. Vance and nodded. They lifted her. They burst out of the cabin, running down the long breezeway, the wheels of the stretcher rattling violently against the floor. Kodiak ran ahead of them, barking furiously, clearing the path, throwing his heavy body against the exit doors to push them open. They hit the outside air. The blizzard slammed into them like a physical wall. The cold was absolute, a freezing, blinding fury that stole the oxygen from their lungs. The snow was knee-deep, piling in massive drifts across the courtyard. Elias roared against the wind, driving his legs forward, using every ounce of his strength to keep the stretcher level as they plowed through the snow toward the elevated helipad at the edge of the cliff. The wind tore at Clara's blankets. Her face was as white as the snow falling around her. Elias kept his eyes locked on her, his jaw set, refusing to let her slip away. He had lost too many people in the dark. He was not going to lose this woman. They reached the edge of the tarmac just as the heavy, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotor blades echoed through the canyon. The sound was deafening, vibrating deep in their chests. Out of the blinding whiteout, the massive search and rescue chopper materialized, its powerful searchlights cutting through the storm like swords. The pilot was fighting the wind, the tail of the chopper swinging violently as he forced the aircraft down onto the frozen concrete. The side doors slid open. The flight medics jumped out, rushing toward the stretcher. Elias and Dr. Vance pushed Clara forward, lifting her up into the brightly lit cabin of the helicopter. The flight medics immediately took over, hooking her up to the onboard monitors, shouting medical jargon over the roar of the engines. Elias stepped back, shielding his face from the brutal rotor wash. The snow was whipping around him in a chaotic vortex. He watched as the helicopter doors slammed shut, the engines whined to a higher pitch. The massive aircraft lifted off the pad, fighting the crosswinds, banking hard to the left before disappearing completely into the black, swirling storm. Elias stood alone on the edge of the helipad. The wind tore at his coat. He looked down. Kodiak was sitting right beside him, right at the very edge of the concrete. The dog was staring up into the dark sky, watching the space where the helicopter had vanished. Kodiak refused to move. He sat there, a silent sentinel in the blizzard, guarding the empty air until the sound of the rotors faded completely into the howling wind. 3 months later, the heavy snows of the Cascades had finally melted, giving way to the sharp, vibrant green of alpine spring. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming pine. The heavy timber frames of the sanctuary looked less imposing in the sunlight, bathed in a warm, golden glow. Clara walked slowly up the winding gravel driveway toward the main entrance. She was pushing a heavy terrain stroller. Inside, bundled in a soft blue blanket, was a perfectly healthy, sleeping baby boy. Clara looked different. The exhaustion that had haunted her eyes for a year was gone. The pale, fragile grief had been replaced by a quiet, profound strength. She stopped near the edge of the courtyard, taking a deep breath of the mountain air. Sitting on a wooden bench near the edge of the tree line was Elias Thorne. He looked different, too. The rigid, combative tension in his shoulders had softened. He was wearing a simple gray sweater, reading a book in the sunlight. Kodiak was lying in the grass beside him, chewing lazily on a thick pine branch. Elias looked up as Clara approached. He closed his book and stood up. Kodiak immediately dropped the branch and trotted over to the stroller, his tail wagging in a slow, rhythmic sweep. The massive dog gently pushed his scarred snout against the edge of the baby blanket, taking a long, deep sniff of the sleeping infant. Clara smiled. She reached out and rested her hand on Kodiak's heavy head, scratching him behind the ears. She looked up at Elias. The silence between them was no longer heavy or defensive. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who had survived the dark. Clara spoke softly. She told Elias that the doctors at the hospital said she had less than 5 minutes. If she had collapsed in the hallway, if she had been alone in the nurse's station, she would not have made it. The baby would not have made it. She looked Elias in the eye, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. She thanked him. She thanked him for catching her. She thanked him for carrying her through the snow. Elias shook his head slowly. He looked down at his dog. He reached out and gently unclipped the heavy, battered titanium military dog tag that hung from Kodiak's tactical collar. The metal was scratched and dented, carrying the history of a dozen war zones. Elias stepped forward and gently placed the cold metal tag into the folds of the baby's blue blanket. He looked at Clara, his voice quiet and steady. He told her that she did not owe him any thanks. He explained that for his entire life, Kodiak had been trained to find soldiers who were buried in the dark. He was trained to find the unfindable. He was trained to dig through the rubble and pull the broken pieces back into the light. Elias looked down at the sleeping baby, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. He told Clara that on that night, in the middle of the blizzard, Kodiak was just doing his job. He was just finding someone who was buried. Clara looked down at the dog tag resting against her son's chest. She realized then that trauma was not just a weight that pulled you down. Sometimes, it was the very thing that connected you to the people who knew exactly how to pull you back up. The unseen bonds of grief and survival were woven into the fabric of the world, carried by the quiet intuition of the animals who walked beside us, guiding us through the white silence and leading us safely home.